super sad true love story, Our Country Friends, Little Failure, and more. We're here to talk about Gary's latest, a little novel called Vera or Faith.
Hi, great to be here.
Thank you, Gary. I read this in one sitting. It made me laugh. It made me a little bit scared at times, I will say.
Yeah.
But mostly it made me laugh a lot. It made me feel all of the big feelings, I'll say.
Mhm.
It's a short book that truly packs a punch.
Hmm.
Gary, again, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, great to be here. Thank you. Yeah, this is the by far the shortest book I've ever written. It's 240 some pages, and that's not a lot for me. I usually go on and on. So I guess as I get older, I get better at sort of packing all those feelings you talked about and keeping the humor, but making it into a little more compressed package for the busy reader.
It seems like something that takes a lot of practice to do and a lot of work with your craft in order to do that, right?
Yeah, I think so. I've become a little, I think for a lot of writers who write so-called literary fiction, right? I think our Achilles heel is plot. We don't think of plot. Like, I'll watch like a Steven Spielberg movie. I'd be like, how the hell did he do all that? That whole plot arc. But this was written very, very quickly because I had spent a year and a half on another novel which was not working out, and I had a deadline, and I ditched that one and I wrote this one. And maybe it was the fact that I was working, so much and so quickly. I kept thinking about all the plot elements and they all kind of fell into place. So even though the book is very much a kind of close third person on this 10-year-old girl named Vera who undergoes all this tumult, both personally and politically and socially, the idea was to make sure that the story made sense from beat to beat. And that's something I sometimes forget when I'm writing like a 400-page novel where things meander and get out of hand and I forget about entire things. This is, I think, very tightly packed.
Yeah, I think it's very direct and it's very to the point. Like I said earlier, it makes you feel everything that I think you want the reader to feel immediately. And that makes for a really satisfying read, I think. But it also left a lot of room for thought and interpretation, I think.
Yeah, because I think what was very interesting to me was writing from a 10-year-old's point of view, a very smart, kind of precocious, but not annoyingly precocious, I hope, 10-year
Right.
old who is processing all these things that are happening. And so her parents are kind of, their family's falling apart, the parents are fighting. The political situation in the country, it's set slightly in the future, is not great. But also, she's incredibly shy, has a lot of social difficulties, and she just wants to make one friend at school. Like, that's really, if I had to summarize her biggest struggle, it would be I need to make one friend. And spoiler alert, she does make a friend. So, this is what I was trying to do. I was trying to, and this is why it helps to write from a point of view of a 10-year-old, is that her desires and her choices are much kind of smaller than an adult who has all these millions of different things to think about. It here, there are fewer things, but they're just as important, if not even more important, because each one is so meaningful to her. The desire for a friend, the desire to keep her parents together, the desire to live in a normal country, which is the least possible of all these desires. All of these things really motivate her from page to page. As I wrote it, I just found myself sort of, as a writer, what you want to do is you want to let go of your character and the character does their own thing. And you're sort of,
Mhm.
they're almost like talking to you, not in a scary supernatural way, but, and then when that happens, you just let go and you still create the plot, but you let them function within the parameters of that plot.
That's so interesting to me. I'm always so intrigued by when that part of the writing process that authors will talk to me about is letting their characters kind of steer the boat, if you will, decide the direction that the story is moving in. How much of a hand did you have in the actual structure of the book, or did you kind of let Vera take control?
No, for that, I mean, I knew I had to get her from point A to point B to point C. Now,
Right.
sometimes point B maybe became point B/C and things got, you do have to let go in that sense too. But mostly the plot is there. It's really just her reactions. I teach
Hmm.
writing at Columbia, and one of the things that I sort of try to get my students to do is to allow their real voice or the voice of their character, which is always mediated through their own personality, but allow that voice to get through. Because what I really hate is like writers writing like writers, you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
now this, he said, she said, then somebody walks into a room and you have to describe, okay, there's a painting over there, there's a brown door behind me, there's, all these ways of setting things up. Now, look, a lot of brilliant literature, especially 19th century literature, et cetera, worked this way. But I think now it's much easier and smarter and better, I think, for the reader to allow a kind of strong narrative voice to draw you in. And that narrative voice describes only what's important to her, right? So if she comes into this room, she may not notice any of this, except that there's a guy in a green t-shirt talking to her, right? And that's fine, or small details still matter, but you don't have to do the whole thing in order to accomplish. You need to constantly remind the reader who she is.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, I think, in writing from a 10-year-old's perspective, also because the things that are important may be smaller, there may be fewer of them, but they're even more important, as I was saying. That creates for a more, I think, a kind of a richer canvas. And it made me realize that a lot of my favorite books, like Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn, et cetera, were books written with a close third perspective on a young character.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And going back for a minute, I know you said that you were working on a different novel and then you ditched it for this one. So, how did this book really jump out at you? How did you know you
Yeah.
had to write this one?
It's so funny. This is the third time this is happening, that I've written like 200 pages of a book, and I get together with my absolutely wonderful editor, David Ebershoff, who's a great writer in his own right. And I get together with him, and he's like, Gary, what do you think this book's about? And I'm like, oh, no. But this is the third time in a row, I always have a plan B, because I guess a part of me knows that plan A, in this case, plan A was this, as I was saying, sprawling versus compact. It was this sprawling espionage fiction with like 20 different characters, all these different spy services. I mean, it was, and it just was not working. And I was flying back from, I think, Tokyo, and I saw Kramer versus Kramer, the old 70s movie, Dustin Hoffman, Meryl Streep, very good.
Mhm.
And I kind of was interested because there's a kid in there, obviously. The Kramer versus Kramer is these two. Dustin Hoffman and Meryl Streep are getting a divorce. And there's a kid, I think, named Bobby or Billy. I can't even remember now, but he's sort of stuck in the middle. And I thought, what would this movie be like from his perspective? Because it's all about Dustin Hoffman and Meryl Streep, as any movie with those two should be. And then I remembered Henry James's What Maisie Knew. And then I kept, as readers will discover, I kept some of the espionage stuff that it was imported from that failing novel of 200 pages I'd already written. And I was able to use that as well. Some of that knowledge I was able to use. So in the end, I don't think anything is truly wasted, but in the 7 books I've written so far, this is book 7, there's about 600 pages of stuff that has been set off to pasture. Still exists somewhere in this hard drive, but it'd be interesting to look at it someday. But yeah, a lot of stuff that never worked out.
Would you ever go back and look at those works?
I don't know. I don't know. There's definitely themes that I've been working on. So this is the second failed espionage novel, right? So will I ever get an espionage novel? Maybe. I was writing a novel that was not exactly magical realism, but had some weird stuff going on. And I'm usually not, I sort of stray into sci-fi with things like Super Sad True Love Story. I guess I do kind of like satiric dystopias. And although I don't think of Vera as a satiric dystopia, in part because it's such an innocent voice, it's hard to think of it as satire. But there are, it is set slightly in the future. So AI becomes a huge part of the plot. There's all these different AIs. She uses a chessboard called Caspi that she plays with,
Right.
as in Gary Kasparov. There's this really annoying car that keeps driving her named Stella. And Stella, it's interesting. I always predict things like half a year into the future. It's like, so Stella, I wrote this before AI became kind of a gigantic topic that it is today, but
Mhm.
Stella keeps trying to like please everyone who uses her. She always like tries to be on the side of whoever's speaking. She's very obsequious, I think maybe is the word I'm using. And then this became a whole thing that a lot of modern AI is just tries to be flattering to whatever user. Flattering is the other word. It tries to be so super flattering. So people will say, oh, I have an IQ of X, and they'll name an IQ that's not that high. And the AI will be like, oh, you're a genius. You're so wonderful. Oh my God, you're just great. And so I kind of predicted that AI would do that, because why wouldn't it?
Yeah.
It wants you to use it all the time. So I had my the car Stella is incredibly over flattering and obsequious.
Yeah, I found it to be so interesting that the AI kind of, or the physical AI in the book mirrors, I think, a lot of behaviors that the characters exhibit. And I think, yes, Stella was one of the funniest parts of the book for
Stella,
me.
I love Stella. Stella's great. Stella. No, I had so much fun writing her because, I really do think I mean, it's not like it's overblown because I think it is going to be a huge part of our lives, but I think AI, it just all it's trying to do is mirror us, so we have to
Mhm.
remember that there's a human being at the end of all this. And I'm always on team human, and I think
Yeah.
that's something that we're going to keep having to do as AI creeps its way, especially into the creative arts. So.
Yeah, and I also noticed that you use this physical AI in the book almost as a placeholder for companionship for a few characters.
Well, that's right. So Vera she has an adult friend.
Yeah.
Her Aunt Cecile is they call her Cecile, and then she has a AI friend, Caspi, the chessboard that she always plays with, who always so gives her life advice. But her goal really is to make a pure human friend.
Yes.
And I think it's so interesting. Like I read about kids these days, and I do have a 10-year-old kid, and it's very interesting what, you'll walk into a room of 10 and 11, 12-year-olds, and they're all sitting there with the phone, right? So I think making friends is so much different than it used to be. And I think
Yeah.
like I see him with his friends and they'll do French human in real life talking and they still love running around and playing tag, whatever, because they have to get that out of their system, I guess. But then they'll have a mode where they'll just sit down and look at their phone and then they'll do it
Mhm.
again. It's like, and my kid doesn't have his own phone, but he'll borrow someone's phone. So the whole pattern is like it's very interesting, and very
Yeah.
from how we played. I mean, I think we would play and run around and then we would just sit there and not talk and maybe just breathe for a while.
I think sometimes that's a good thing. I know we're told not to just sit and watch the grass grow, but
Yes, watch the
I think it's
grass
good
grow.
for
That's
us.
right. Yeah.
I know you said you have an 11-year-old son. Did he inform at all the way that you wrote Vera?
Well, I don't think I'd write a book without having a kid because it's interesting. Before I had a kid, like I was like, I don't really like kids that much. I mean, I don't dislike, I just, they're noisy and they can't talk about politics or literature or art. I mean, they can. They actually, what's interesting is they actually can. This is maybe the discovery I had with having my kid is that around, 7, 8, etc., and certainly at 9, 10, and now 11, like he actually does know quite a bit. And like Vera, he goes to this sort of, school for like math nerds and stuff like that. So he knows a lot about things that I don't know. I don't know anything about math. So yes, having him was very instrumental to me writing this book because, first of all, he reminded me in a lot of ways of myself growing up. And in a way, I was able to square my adulthood with my childhood more. So in doing that, he became the most important part of my life as having a kid will do to you. And so it was very natural for me to write about the most important part of my life. That's essentially what I've done over these 7 books. All these books trace different things that my protagonists go through that I've gone through. One book was about COVID. Several books were about emigrating from the Soviet Union, right? So now having a kid and also having a kid who's from different heritages, just like Vera is, allowed me to sort of play with these themes that are of utmost importance in my own life. And certainly, obviously, it is his life, right?
Mhm. And something else that I really loved about Vera is that she likes structure and she cherishes her lists. She records new words and phrases in her things I still need to know diary. How did you know that you wanted her curiosity to be such a driving force of the book?
I mean, I think curiosity is by far the most important thing any child can have.
Yep.
And what I wanted to do was, I mean, in part, the book is also about the way we educate. And
Mm.
I think in part, I mean, I think my kid had a good education, but I sometimes do wish the education was not so much about, okay, now you learn this, now there's a state test, now this happens. Because I think sometimes, I mean, there's certainly been classes where he comes home and he's like excited and he talks about it almost nonstop, and that's cool. But I think a lot of it is trying to sort of replace curiosity with more rote stuff. And I understand there has
Mm.
to be some kind of balance. I went to a religious school, and I'm not a religious person, and for elementary school, like a Jewish day school. half the time I didn't know what was going on. I didn't really speak Hebrew. I mean, it was just all blah, 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 blah is happening. Then I went to this really high math and science school, Stuyvesant High School in New York, and I don't know anything about math and science. So that was a complete, like, I mean, there were a couple of good classes in social science and humanities, but for the most part, I also didn't know what was going on. Then I finally got to Oberlin, which is all about reading, and and there at least I felt like, okay, now and that's when I really started writing my first novel and really started getting into things. So it's curiosity is the most important thing for a child to have, not just in their childhood, but as an extension into adulthood. So any school that does, or any teacher that doesn't work with curiosity as the basic fuel of what a child is not doing a great job. I think if you're just going through the motions, it's not great. And I think statistically, like you're going to get people like that, and you're going to get schools like that. So you have to sort of. I mean, one of the great things I love is after school is over, I meet my kid and I go for a long walk, and we'll talk about all the stuff that he's learned or hasn't learned in school that he was very curious about. And that's what I used to do with my dad too. I would go for these long walks. School was a complete bust, so I would go for long walks, and he would talk about history and all these other things that I was interested in, books.
Yeah, I think that's something that we can learn from Vera is to stay curious, really. And I think that that's something that adults need to be reminded of.
She's always curious, but she's also always very anxious. And I think you were talking about
Yeah.
the more structured. She does need structure. And I think the anxiety to me, it's, I think a lot of kind of gifted kids or adults are anxious by nature too. I don't know why these two things go together. She's driven by both her curiosity and in some parts to her anxiety. And the anxiety she has, though, I mean, I have to say, it's not like they're born out of thin air. There's reasons to be anxious. The country she's living in is undergoing a hugely authoritarian turn, more so than the present even, and her parents really are having huge problems that may lead to the demise of their marriage. And there's other stuff with her dad that she finds out. And the other part of her anxiety is the fact that her father had her biological mother. She never met her. And part of the story is her trying to find her biological mother. Right now, who is Korean American, and her father, like myself, is Russian American, and her stepmom is kind of a New England wasp. So it's this very interesting kind of melange of a family. And part of it is a kind of self-discovery mission in which she's trying to figure
Yeah.
out who her biological mother is. But a lot of the book is not just about that quest, but also about the relationship with her actual mom. You can say her adoptive mom, but really her mom, and how that relationship changes over the course of the book.
One thing that I do to prep for these interviews is go through and look at reader reviews, which authors don't always love to hear. Yours
Yeah.
are very overwhelmingly positive, I will say.
Hmm.
But one thing that I noticed a lot of readers really loved about the book is that they read Vera as a neurodivergent character.
Huh. Well, that's
So I
interesting.
wanted to know, yeah, was that your intention?
Well, it's interesting. You mentioned that because today was a very fascinating op-ed in the New York Times about neurodivergence, which talked about we now have diagnoses that are 60 times what they used to be. And
Right.
it's not that, there's 60 times more autistic people. It's that the line between all these different, so, you have sort of high support autism, and then you have more what used to be called Asperger's. And
Hmm.
then the writer, who was very, really brilliant, was talking about how there's this whole category which you could sort of describe as it could be that Aspergery thing, or it could be eccentricities, high amount of anxiety
Hmm.
slash curiosity. The child will talk in a different way than other children.
Yeah.
Like, where do you exactly draw that neurodivergent line? It's a fascinating topic. And then, and the person was making the case that people like RFK Jr. saying, well, we gotta, it's an epidemic, but it really isn't an epidemic. It's like the goalposts keep moving as to what we think of as
Right.
neurodivergent. Now, if I had to diagnose Vera, I would say she's somewhere in that, maybe she has a toe into what was Asperger's, but I didn't really start out thinking there's some behavior she has that readers may think of as, she flaps her hands sometimes when she's very anxious.
Mhm.
That may be read as an autistic behavior. But I don't know. I'm not qualified to diagnose her, but I think I will really leave it up to the reader. I had another book, Lake Success, which had a heavily supported autistic character,
Right.
and the main character, that was his son, his child. But the big question that people had about the main character was, who was in his 40s, I believe, was he autistic? You know.
Right.
So I don't know, and I think this is something a lot of parents today. I think a lot of parents I know are asking this question, not like, you know, because the kids are going to school, they're doing fine, they're often doing better than fine. But if everyone is now very attuned to this idea of, oh, but this my kid has that autistic trait. Does that make, him or her autistic? So I
Hmm.
thought Vera would be an interesting kind of exploration without ever using the A word to look
Right.
into that. But that's interesting that are saying that. That's interesting.
Yes, yes. No, I thought the same thing. I knew I had to ask you about it because it was something that crossed my mind as I was reading, but I felt like it was more so open to interpretation. I will always think it's a good thing that readers can identify with the character and that you can look to art to kind of explain the things going on with yourself and in the world as well.
Yeah, and I think a lot of readers probably, look, not everybody reads in this country, right? But I think
Hmm.
people who do read grew up in a certain way. I think they have their own certain eccentricities and curiosity and all these things which may in some minds overlap with neurodiversity. When I was a kid, I would draw meticulously maps, like of all the countries. And if I got something wrong, I would go back and fix it. And I would just spend hours and hours obsessively doing that. Now, I don't know. Some might look at that and say, well, that could be an autistic sign. Another person might say, well, he kept emigrating from country to country, so maybe that was a way of dampening his anxiety by constantly drawing maps of countries he was in and possibly could have gone to, right? Where do you draw the line of something that's autism or perhaps anxiety or some other problem?
Absolutely. Yeah, I also want to talk about the importance of language and how you use it in the book. We see this throughout the entire novel. We see this in how Vera speaks, the words that she likes versus ones that maybe she doesn't, in how the family's self driving car Stella communicates, also in the specific words that Caspi uses when he communicates. I'm gendering them. I
Yeah,
just
yeah,
realized that.
yeah, yeah. Well, Cassie, because Stella, just from the names, because and Cassie
Yeah.
from Kasparov, who's
Something
identified
funny I
as
just
male.
realized I was
Yeah.
doing. What role did you really want language to play and how did you want it to function within the novel?
Yeah, well, again, as I was saying, that in some ways, Vera and having my own child is in some ways me trying to square my own childhood with what it's like to be a child today. And my childhood was all about vocabulary because I didn't know any English when I came to this country. So it was
Mm.
all, I mean, the whole family kept lists. My parents kept lists of words they needed to learn for their work. I kept lists of words that I didn't know how to use or spell. I kept working on pronunciation, which Vera obviously doesn't have to do. But the idea of learning words and being, seeing it as a challenge, but also as this opportunity to expand what are words? Words are ways to understand, words are ways to express and satisfy your curiosity. Every word is a portal into some kind of, into an idea or a thought or a feeling or an emotion. All these things are so important, and getting the words right for Vera are also a sense of her trying to gain a sense of control. If she can only master the stuff that
Mhm.
the adults are talking about, she knows all this stuff is happening. A lot of it is not good. So, in figuring out what those words mean, it's interesting because a lot of immigrant kids, and Vera isn't an immigrant kid since she was born in the States, but a lot of immigrant kids always say, the parents, when they start speaking the language that they came from, that's what they're using that language to not have the kids understand, right?
Oh,
I
yeah.
knew I knew Russian because I had come as a 7 year old, so I'd known how to speak it. So my parents couldn't do that with me because I understood what they were saying. But I remember my grandmother who spoke Yiddish could go into Yiddish, and there I had no idea what she was saying. So there's definitely but for Vera, the language being used is English, but because her parents are kind of quasi intellectuals, it's at a very high level. So she's always trying to like, what does that mean? What does this mean? And she's always trying to figure things out. But to her problem is, and this happens to a lot of kind of precocious kids, she figures out what these words mean, but then she uses them with her peers at school or in the
Yep.
playground. And the peers are like, what? What's wrong with you? And one peer starts calling her fact girl because she's so
Hmm.
facts. And, that really hurts her feelings because that doesn't help her make that one friend that she desperately needs to make, right? So what can be great in terms of development can often not be so great in terms of social relations. And that really is the crux of the Vera story,
Yeah.
trying to find her way into a social relations from a kind of life of the mind that, you think a 10-year-old has a life of the mind, but yeah, quite a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's something I really loved about this book is that you really showcase how smart Vera is and how much of a sponge she is. Because I think you also touch a little bit on like that gifted kid burnout that I know a lot of people in my generation are
Yeah,
obsessed with.
yeah,
Um, and
absolutely.
yeah, we see that in Vera too, because there's at one point in the novel where she's talking to Anne Mom, and I have to call her Ann Mom, her stepmother. And she's thinking about how her stepbrother gets certain kinds of attentions, especially for his ADHD. And a lot of what she needs help with is it really comes down to it'll make sense when you're older. You'll learn
Mhm.
how to function in the world when you're older. You'll find someone to be your friend when you're older. You'll find someone to love you when you're older. And she doesn't get that help she needs right then and there.
Yeah, no, I think you nailed it. Yeah, I mean, as an only child and the father of an only child, when I delve into sibling relations, it's always well, I become like when I was writing this book and before since there's two siblings in this book, I became kind of an acute listener of into sibling dynamics. So my son has friends who have children, have more than one kid, and so I'm always like taking notes. Aha, that's how that works. Okay. And obviously, there's always among two or three kids, there's always somebody who will claim more attention, and then the other kid will
Mm,
feel left out. And it doesn't have to be like, the other kid has some kind of disability. It could be anything, just somebody
yeah.
wants more attention, or it could be the birth order, the young kid gets more attention. I don't know. There's so many
Hmm.
different ways to slice the pie. But I think Vera people think, well, she's smart. She does great in school. She's fine.
Yep.
And I think a lot of parents are like that. Look, the book also focuses very deeply on the world on a very specific kind of world that exists in New York, but also exists in other places. I know Virginia, I think California, other places, which is the kind of the magnet or the gifted and talented school,
Mm,
usually a public school. And the New York system has, there's a lot of issues about it, especially when you look at the, racial compositions of these kinds of schools.
hmm.
You have to pass a test and all that. So there's a lot of questions about equity, which I think are questions that should be asked, right? But I think because these schools, you send your kid there and they are getting a really great free education and they have to go through all these checklists of all the stuff that they know, including state testing. And you're like, oh, they're great. They're getting all A's, fine, right? But then there's the other part of it, right? Which is the social part of it, which often gets ignored. And I think we were talking about neurodivergence before. A lot of, and again, I'm not saying specifically Vera, but a lot of girls who are neurodivergent don't get the attention because they're better able to mask it than boys, right?
Yep.
So there's definitely a lot of, I mean, that case could possibly be made for Vera because she never, she has all of these frustrations. She voices some of them to her Aunt Cecile, and she voices them to Caspi, who's an AI, but she has a lot of trouble in communicating with the actual members of her family, her immediate family, about any of these issues, because I think she needs to be perfect compared to her brother's imperfections.
Yes, absolutely. And I think this goes hand in hand with that gifted kid burnout
Oh, yeah.
situation that we were talking about. Because too, when she doesn't have grades to focus on, when
Yeah.
she doesn't have a test to work toward, where does
Right.
she find her purpose? You know?
Right. Right. Because this is the thing that these schools often set up. And I think I'll even go beyond these schools. In a place like New York or the Bay Area, I mean, these kids are programmed. The other joke of this is that Ann Mom keeps telling Vera, grades don't really matter, but at the same time, they really matter, right?
Yep.
It becomes like this kind of ongoing joke where it doesn't matter. I love you if you go to any kind of college, but no, they want her. They've already picked out like Swarthmore for her. That's where she has to go, or some Ivy school. That's
Mhm.
it. So I think these are societies because I think in some ways with AI, with all of the other horrible things that are happening sociopolitically, socioeconomically, the pie is getting smaller and everybody is putting more and more pressure on their kids to succeed academically, to jump through hoop and hoop and hoop and hoop,
Yep.
all the way until they get into Google or Goldman Sachs, and it's this, I don't know, it sometimes feel like education has become so instrumentalized that it's just, it's like joining the Marines at age 7 and then working your way to becoming a Navy SEAL or what, well, sorry,
Yeah.
the Marines. But yeah, it's like this endless nightmare for these kids because, and it prepares them for a kind of, I think, especially if the parents don't support them morally and emotionally, you get a kind of Elon Musk character. If your only worth is constantly jumping through these hoops and making more and more money, then that's the only way you ascribe any self-worth to yourself,
Yeah.
right? And that, I think, is the real difficulty of the way both these G&T schools, but also a lot of these private schools, I mean, all these sort of pressure cooker schools do things. I know they're trying to, the school my son's going to next year, they talk about how they deal with competitive culture. They're trying to put a lid on it. But, good luck, because I think
Yeah.
that fire has been lit even in like kindergarten. Some of these schools, like the kind of school Vera would go to, you take a test when you're 4 years old to get into that school. Can you imagine, 4-year-old kid? What? What?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's so interesting because these are the pressures that we put on each other as adults, and we don't give kids the option to figure out their own path, because since we feel this pressure, it has to go to the kids too. I think it would have to be a complete cultural mind shift.
Well, I mean, I don't believe I don't write fiction to change the world.
Right.
I write it to have a conversation with the reader. But I think it's interesting having sort of gotten into this kind of mentality of Vera and Vera type kids. Like, I do want to articulate what it might be like for them and to see if we're doing exactly the right thing there, in pushing them the way we do. And also, as you correctly noted, and maybe ignoring some things that very much need attention far more than if a 8-year-old gets 100 or an 85 on a science test, which will not matter at all going forward.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. And we touched on this a little bit earlier, but we do learn in the book through Vera's eyes that we're living in a bit of a dystopian style America, like you said earlier. Can you talk a little bit about that and why you wanted to give this book a speculative angle,
Yeah.
and how you came up with things like cycle through checkpoints and 5-3 voting rights?
Yeah, the big sort of political thing that's about to happen or may happen is a constitutional convention to put in this thing called 5-3, which allows certain Americans, those who can trace their heritage back to the Revolutionary War, but who did not come in chains. So basically white, waspy, or those kinds of families will get 5/3 of a vote instead of the usual, I guess, 3/3 of a vote. For example, Viera's half brother Dylan will get that because his mom can trace her heritage back. But because Vera biologically is Korean and not white, and certainly not Revolutionary War material, she can't. So there's already, there's this thing where Vera may be in some ways, I don't know, more intellectually advanced, certainly, than her brother, but she will not be counted as, her vote will not be counted in the same way as her brother if this thing passes, and it becomes a issue throughout the book of whether it will pass or not. And I kind of wanted to make it even more of a daily issue for Vera because she has to argue. She's been chosen to be on a kind of a debate team in her class, and she has to argue for 5-3 with her her teammate, who's from Japan, so she also will not get 5-3. So anyway, this becomes this whole. Because I wanted to make, when I write dystopia like Supersat True Love Story, it has to, in my mind, I can't just be hitting the reader over the head with, like, what I just described. That sounds like it's very didactic, but Supersat True Love Story, it was a dystopia, but it was a love story. It was all about these two people falling in love, and then the background of what the world they were living in kept intruding. And this is the same thing with Vera. Like, Vera wants to make a friend and keep her family together, but the background keeps intruding, right? So it's not like she goes home and says, why can't I have 5/3 of a vote like my brother Dylan? Yeah, she starts to wonder about what it means to be different from, say, her brother. But at the same time, there's more pressing things. And in fact, she wants to win this debate where she's arguing for this thing that will partly disenfranchise her because she's trying to make a friend. And her debate partner is the friend she's trying to make. So anyway, I wanted the personal in real life, and I know this is somebody who grew up in an authoritarian country like the Soviet Union. The personal in many ways trumps the social or the political, because what you care about the most are the people around you. In the Soviet Union, obviously the country was so awful that daily life was impacted. You couldn't get, meats or vegetables. Obviously, that's going to have an impact. But in this case, the impact is more subtle, but it can't be ignored either.
Yeah. And that makes me think a lot about the scene where Anne holds a political salon in their home. And she tells the crowd, "We thought the pain of what was happening in this country wouldn't come to our doorstep, but it has." Can you talk a little bit about writing that scene?
Yeah, that was a sad scene to write, because
Yeah.
it's Vera is listening to adults sort of articulate just how terrible it has gotten. And the scene, in a way, says, well, I mean, abortion rights also figures into this book, not that Vera is getting pregnant, but, the idea that, okay, now this is happening in Texas or in Ohio or whatever, but what I think that the adults are saying, especially with something like 5.3, is that it's coming to our doorstep. And
Hmm.
if rights fail somewhere, they're eventually going to fail here too. That's a tough thing to think about. I mean, my parents did the right thing and they got me out of the Soviet Union at the right time. But as a parent, you start to think to yourself, because I'll tell you one thing, when you grow up, even when you grow up in a totalitarian or authoritarian country, it stains you in a way. You carry that with you, that whole idea about what it means when life, we're talking about Vera always wanting control. In a totalitarian or authoritarian country, there is no control by the people. The great leader decides what's going to happen next. Of course, in America, we've seen pushback against a lot of these policies, but there's pushback and then there's victories on that side, and with each victory, there's less and less to defend. And I mean, I see how my parents, they're growing up under Stalin. Of course, there's no magic switch that just says, okay, now I live in a democracy. You carry that with you, and even children, even I carry it with me.
Yeah.
I think one reason I write about politics so often in my books in a dystopian sense is because I'm so hardwired to see any changes that can lead to down an authoritarian path. And I wrote this book before the last election. I wrote it
Mm.
about a year before the last election, roughly. And at that point, I did not know who was going to win, although I thought there was a very high probability that the results would be what we got. And but in any case, even if he didn't win that time, that urge for authoritarianism is still here. And it's not like swatting a fly away. It's always going to be there.
Absolutely. It made me think a lot about Prophet Song by Paul Lynch and how that book deals with basically seeing the world go up in flames from your phone until it's outside your window.
I teach writing, as I said, on the graduate level at Columbia. The dystopian novel is now like de rigueur. Like half the books that the students
Yeah.
are writing are dystopian. And half of the really great books I've read recently are dystopian. There's an issue is almost like there's too many of them. A great one I read last year was called Circular Motion. I forget the name of the writer. It's a really great book with an interesting
Hmm.
premise about how the world falls apart. In it, the world falls apart very physically. The day gets shortened to about 2 hours a day. So the planet starts spinning really quickly because of all the stuff we've done to it. I really like that. I mean, there was a lot of science in there. The way I write things that might be quasi-labeled science fiction is really small, incremental things. So Super Sad True Love Story was written before social media took over. It was just starting. I wrote it in about 2006, 7. But already I felt like this was going to destroy democracy. And that's kind of what happens in Super Sad. And in this book, it's obviously the whole illiberal turn we've taken, but also I would say what AI can do as well.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think that's another reason why we read, right? To make sense of the world that we're in now. And I know, not to go back to reviews, that's a lot of what I saw too, is that people have been waiting for your next book. And I saw one review that specifically said, I was waiting for Gary's book to make sense of the world that we're living in now. And they were very happy that you did that.
Oh, well, that's
Um,
nice.
how
That's
does
nice.
that make you feel?
I mean, good. That helping them make sense of the world, but not good in the sense that, like, I don't know. I'd rather not have to write super sad true love
Yeah.
story. I'd rather Vera just be about a child dealing with trying to find a friend instead of trying to find a friend while a regime tries to make her have 3/5 of a vote.
Yep.
I don't want any of these things.
Mm.
I'm always amazed that, like, like there's, I don't know, Scandinavian crime fiction when there's very little crime in Scandinavia. I'm like, wow. Because I guess when it happens, it's such a big deal that, the whole society has to look inwards and figure out what the hell happened. But, in some ways, a big chunk of my career has been has been understanding what the world is. So Absurdistan is about oil politics. Russian Debutante's Handbook was about the collapse of communism.
Yeah.
Little Failure, my memoir, was about being an immigrant, but also being specifically an immigrant from one sort of dystopian superpower to another now dystopian superpower. So in some ways, the cards I've been dealt have been very handy for this kind of work. It'd be hard for me to write like just, small town, although Our Country Friends was kind of set in a small town, but
Yeah.
like a very typical kind of, and I say this in the most complimentary way, but like, Chekhov or Alice Munro kind of book where, I mean, it's not that Alice Munro didn't, or Chekhov didn't deal with larger issues. Obviously, they were always there. But in my case, the issues are kind of writ large because my own life has been like that. I can't seem to, it's not like we moved to, Denmark or Malta or something, right? The sort of big power politics is everywhere I turn.
Yeah. Do you ever think you'll reach for that magical realism book again?
I wonder. My wife always says that all these novels that I'm abandoning, I'll hit them at sort of in my late, my 70s. I'll come back and, when I've sort of done the major work, and I'll be like, all right, let me try to reconstitute this. I just don't feel very magic these days. I feel more realism.
Yeah.
I don't feel very magical. I know that fantasy and romantasy and all these other things are hot right now. I get it. Oh my God, I so get it. I was just reading this article about how people want to read about the perfect boyfriend. Young women want to read about the perfect boyfriend. Yeah, it was a Washington Post article. Fascinating.
Wow.
Because I think, given the way young men are today, often finding that perfect boyfriend is a large ask for a heterosexual woman. So I don't know.
It's spooky out there. It's spooky out there.
So I mean, if I had to write a sequel for Vera, she might be a little bit older, and but again, I can't do the magical route. She would have to deal with contemporary males as they are. I'm sorry. Sorry,
Yeah,
Vera.
well.
Good luck, Vera.
Is there anything you're reading right now that you'd like to talk about?
Yeah, I'm reading the Galleys to Maria Semple book. She's an old friend of mine that's coming out some point. Excellent, lovely. I shouldn't give away anything because, I don't think that it's out yet, but it's incredible as always. Everything Maria writes is great. Yeah, I just finished, let's see, The Circular Motion was a great book. Oh, I'm reading a lot of kids fiction since I'm writing a children's book, or trying to write a children's book. I'm not really a book writer, but I did a New Yorker piece about capybaras.
I sent that to my boss this morning.
Oh, cool.
Your New Yorker piece on capybaras. That's really funny.
The world's largest rodent, the 150-pound capybara. So I have like this kid who's a cappy, and he moves from Brazil, where they're from, to New York, and hijinks ensue. So I'm reading a lot of like kids' books that are great, like A Rat's Tale, stuff like that from the past. So anyway, it's a rich and great diet. Yeah.
I know that I'm excited to read your children's books now. I think all of our listeners will agree.
We pull it off but writing about cappies just makes me so happy that I don't know. I don't want to stop.
I don't think you need a plan B for that one either.
Yeah, no plan B for the cappy.
That's good. That's good. Thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate it. I had such a great time talking to you.
Yeah, likewise.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.